Marcus Hale is a wealthy businessman driven by ambition and hardened by years of chasing success. But when a sudden health crisis leads him to a chance encounter with Dr. Evelyn Carter, a compassionate, yet formidable physician, his world begins to unravel. A single act of kindness sets Marcus on an unexpected path of self-discovery, redemption, and transformation. As he learns to rebuild bridges with those he's hurt and embrace the strength in humility, Marcus finds himself immersed in a mission far greater than he ever imagined. But will he have the courage to face his past and embrace a future built on connection and kindness? The rhythmic hum of the engine filled the car as Marcus Hale navigated his sleek black sedan through downtown traffic. His reflection in the rearview mirror, a middle-aged man with thinning salt and pepper hair and sharp, calculating eyes, scrutinized his appearance. Marcus, a real estate developer, prided himself on control, competence, and success. But beneath his tailored suits and carefully curated image was a man deeply unsettled by imperfection, whether in others or, heaven forbid, in himself. This morning, he had noticed an unusual rash creeping up his forearms. It was red and unsightly, marring the skin he had always considered one of his few untouchable assets. Marcus despised weakness, even more so when it appeared in himself. After some internal debate, he decided to book an urgent consultation at the city's most renowned hospital. He expected efficiency, expertise, and discretion, nothing less. When Marcus entered the hospital lobby, the stark white walls and polished floors reflected his mood. Clinical, detached. The receptionist greeted him with a polite but practiced smile, directing him to the dermatologist's office on the third floor. His eyes swept over the waiting room, assessing the people around him as if their presence might diminish the hospital's reputation. "Mr. Hale?" A young nurse called his name. Marcus rose, adjusting his tie. He followed her to a consultation room and took a seat. Minutes ticked by before the door opened, and Dr. Evelyn Carter stepped in. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," she said warmly, her voice steady and calm. Evelyn was a striking woman in her mid-30s, with smooth brown skin and an air of quiet authority. Her white coat bore the embroidered title, MD, Dermatology. Marcus's first reaction was immediate and visceral. His eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "You're the dermatologist?" he asked, the skepticism in his tone unmistakable. Evelyn maintained her composure. "Yes, I am. I've reviewed your file. Let's take a closer look at the issue you're experiencing." Her professionalism only seemed to irritate Marcus further. He crossed his arms and leaned back, his posture defensive. "I was expecting someone with more experience," he said, his words cutting and deliberate. "Is there a senior doctor available?" Evelyn paused, but didn't flinch. Years of enduring subtle and overt prejudices had taught her how to remain unshaken. "I assure you, Mr. Hale, I am fully qualified to assist you. Shall we begin?" Marcus's jaw tightened. He let out a huff, but extended his arm reluctantly. Evelyn examined the rash with the same meticulous care she afforded every patient. She asked precise questions, her voice even and measured, ignoring Marcus's icy demeanor. As she finished her examination, Evelyn began to explain the potential causes and outlined a treatment plan. Marcus interrupted. "You don't sound very sure of yourself, doctor," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Maybe I should get a second opinion." Evelyn's fingers tightened slightly on her clipboard, but her expression remained composed. "That's your prerogative, Mr. Hale. However, I recommend addressing this promptly to avoid complications." What followed was the breaking point. Marcus grabbed the water bottle sitting on the table beside him and, in a fit of frustration, poured its contents over Evelyn's hands. "Consider this my feedback," he said coldly before standing and storming out. Evelyn froze for a moment, stunned. Water dripped from her hands onto the tiled floor. The sting of humiliation burned in her chest, but she refused to let it show. She calmly reached for a paper towel, dried her hands, and resumed her day. Marcus returned to his office later that day, his mind still buzzing from the confrontation. His irritation was compounded by his worsening rash, which now itched incessantly. He dismissed it as a minor inconvenience, refusing to acknowledge the nagging thought that maybe, just maybe, he had been too quick to judge. Marcus lived alone in a penthouse apartment overlooking the city. The space was meticulously organized, every piece of furniture carefully chosen to project sophistication. Yet the emptiness of the rooms echoed his solitude. His daughter, Madison, had once called the apartment soulless, a description he couldn't entirely refute. That evening, Madison visited, her long chestnut hair tied back in a loose ponytail. She was in her early 20s, a spirited and empathetic contrast to her father's stoic nature. She set a paper bag of takeout on the kitchen counter. "How was your day?" she asked casually. "Productive," Marcus replied, avoiding her gaze. Madison noticed the red blotches on his arm. "What's that? Are you okay?" "It's nothing," he said, brushing her off. "Did you see a doctor?" "I tried. She was unimpressive." Madison frowned. "What does that mean?" Marcus hesitated, then waved his hand dismissively. "She wasn't the right fit for me. Let's leave it at that." Madison's eyes narrowed. "Dad, sometimes I don't get you. Why does everything have to meet your impossible standards?" Her words stung more than Marcus cared to admit. He deflected the conversation, steering it toward Madison's upcoming semester in college. But her words lingered in his mind long after she left. For Evelyn, the day ended as uneventfully as it had begun. She returned home to a modest but warm townhouse she shared with her grandmother, Rose. The walls were lined with family photos, each a testament to the love and support that had shaped Evelyn's life. Rose, a retired schoolteacher, greeted her with a warm hug. "Tough day?" she asked, noticing the weariness in Evelyn's eyes. Evelyn nodded, but managed to smile. "Nothing I can't handle." Over dinner, Evelyn shared the day's events. Rose listened intently, her hands folded on the table. "I don't understand people like him," Evelyn admitted. "It's not the first time, but it doesn't get any easier." Rose reached across the table and squeezed Evelyn's hand. "You've always handled yourself with grace, Evelyn. Don't let one person's ignorance overshadow the good you're doing." Evelyn smiled faintly. Rose's unwavering support was her anchor, a reminder of the resilience she had inherited from generations of strong women. 2 days later, Marcus woke in the middle of the night, his arm burning with pain. The rash had spread, and his skin was swollen and tender. Alarmed, he drove himself to the hospital, his usual stoic facade replaced by desperation. When he arrived at the emergency room, the staff moved quickly to assess him. A nurse informed him that the attending physician would see him shortly. Marcus lay on the hospital bed, his pride bruised by the vulnerability of his situation. The door opened, and in walked Dr. Evelyn Carter. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice steady and professional. "It seems we meet again." Marcus's face flushed with embarrassment. He opened his mouth to speak, but found himself at a loss for words. Evelyn continued, ignoring the tension. "Your condition has worsened significantly. We need to act quickly to prevent further complications." For the first time in his life, Marcus felt powerless. As Evelyn explained the necessary procedures, he realized that his fate was now in the hands of the very person he had dismissed and insulted. Evelyn didn't dwell on their previous encounter. Her focus was entirely on treating Marcus, her every action guided by the oath she had taken as a physician. As she worked, Marcus couldn't help but notice her calm precision, her unwavering confidence. For the first time, he saw her not as the object of his judgment, but as the expert she was. That night, as the treatment began to take effect, Marcus lay awake in the hospital bed. Shame gnawed at him, but so did something unfamiliar: gratitude. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the dimly lit hospital room. Marcus Hale lay on the bed, his eyes tracing the ceiling tiles as the events of the night replayed in his mind. His left arm, now wrapped in cooling ointments and bandages, felt less painful, but the discomfort had shifted inward. Dr. Evelyn Carter's voice lingered in his thoughts, calm, precise, and entirely devoid of resentment. Despite his humiliation, she had treated him with the professionalism and kindness he hadn't earned. Marcus clenched his jaw, hating the vulnerability her care had exposed in him. By the morning, Marcus was feeling physically better but emotionally unmoored. A nurse entered to check his vitals, offering a cheery smile. "Good news, Mr. Hale," she said while adjusting the foreline. "Your condition is stabilizing." Dr. Carter's quick diagnosis and treatment made all the difference. Marcus grunted, unsure how to respond. "She's amazing, isn't she?" the nurse continued. "A real role model for all of us. She takes her time to mentor, even though she's the medical director." Marcus froze. He stared at the nurse, her words sinking in like stones in a pond. "The medical director?" he echoed, his voice almost a whisper. "Didn't you know?" The nurse tilted her head curiously. "Dr. Carter oversees this entire hospital. She only takes on direct cases when it's serious, like yours." Marcus leaned back against the pillows, stunned. He had dismissed her as inexperienced, yet she held the very authority and expertise he claimed to respect. The realization left him both embarrassed and intrigued. Later that day, Marcus's daughter, Madison, arrived to visit. She carried a small bouquet of yellow daisies, their bright color stark against the hospital's sterile backdrop. "Dad," she said softly, setting the flowers on the bedside table. "How are you feeling?" "Better," he admitted. "The doctor seems competent." "That's a surprise," Madison said with a slight edge in her tone. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" Madison sighed and sat in the chair by his bed. "When I came over the other night, you brushed off what the doctor said. You didn't even give her a chance, did you?" "I had my reasons," Marcus muttered. "Reasons or excuses?" Madison countered. Her voice was calm, but her eyes held the weight of years of frustration. "Dad, you can't keep living like this. Pushing people away, judging them before you know them, it's no wonder you're always alone." Marcus flinched. Her words hit closer to home than he cared to admit. "I'm not alone," he said defensively. Madison shook her head. "You are, and it's not because people don't care. It's because you refuse to see them for who they are." The room fell silent. Madison stood, her face softening. "I hope you'll think about that," she said before leaving. That evening, Marcus was restless. The hospital walls seemed to close in around him, amplifying the weight of Madison's words. His pride had always been his armor, but now it felt more like a prison. A knock at the door broke his thoughts. It was a young nurse, different from the one earlier. "Mr. Hale, Dr. Carter wanted me to bring this to you," she said, holding out a neatly folded pamphlet. Marcus took it reluctantly. The pamphlet outlined the symptoms, causes, and treatments for his condition in plain language. A handwritten note was clipped to the corner. "Mr. Hale, I thought this might help answer any lingering questions. Wishing you a swift recovery. Dr. Carter." The simple gesture caught Marcus off guard. He set the pamphlet on the bedside table, staring at it for a long moment. The next morning, Dr. Carter visited to check on his progress. She entered the room with the same composed demeanor, clipboard in hand. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," she said, her tone professional but not unfriendly. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," he admitted. Then, after a pause, he added, "Thank you." Evelyn glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "That's good to hear. Your recovery is on track, but we'll need to monitor the treatment closely for the next few days." Marcus hesitated. He wanted to say more, to acknowledge the incident that had left a stain on both of their memories. But the words stuck in his throat. "Dr. Carter," he began, his voice faltering slightly. "Yes." He opened his mouth, then closed it again, retreating into silence. Evelyn waited patiently, but didn't press him. "I appreciate what you've done," he finally said, though it felt inadequate. "You're welcome," she replied simply before leaving the room. Marcus spent the rest of the day reflecting on the stark differences between his world and Evelyn's. He thought about her calm resilience in the face of his behavior and the dignity with which she carried herself. Her actions had forced him to confront a part of himself he had long ignored, a part that judged, dismissed, and rejected without understanding. That evening, Marcus struck up a conversation with the man in the next hospital bed, an older gentleman named Samuel Peterson. "Dr. Carter's treating you too?" Samuel asked, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Yes," Marcus replied, surprised by how readily Samuel spoke of her. "She's a miracle worker," Samuel said. "Last year I was in bad shape, worse than you, I bet. She didn't just treat me. She treated me like I mattered, like I wasn't just another patient." Marcus frowned. You sound like you know her well. I do, Samuel said. She's more than a doctor. She's a teacher, a mentor, a fighter for people who don't always get a fair shot. If more folks were like her, the world would be a better place. Samuel's words stayed with Marcus long after their conversation ended. The next morning, as Marcus sipped his lukewarm hospital coffee, Madison walked in with an unexpected guest, his business partner, Alan Wexler. Marcus, Alan exclaimed, his jovial tone filling the room. I heard you were down for the count. How are you holding up? Better, Marcus said, though his usual confidence was absent. Alan turned to Madison. Your dad's a tough guy, isn't he? Never lets anything get to him. Madison didn't respond, but her expression suggested she wasn't convinced. The visit was brief, but it left Marcus feeling exposed. For years, he had built his life around a facade of strength and self-reliance. Now, for the first time, he was starting to see the cracks in that armor. As the day wore on, Marcus found himself replaying moments from the past few days, Madison's pointed words, Samuel's praise for Evelyn, and the nurse's revelation about her role as medical director. Slowly, a new perspective began to take shape. He realized that kindness wasn't weakness. It was strength, and it was a strength he had underestimated for far too long. That night, as the hospital quieted and the world outside darkened, Marcus lay in bed and decided. Tomorrow, he would start the process of becoming the man he wanted to be, the man he should have been all along. The soft shuffle of shoes against the polished hospital floor stirred Marcus Hale from his restless thoughts. Another day in the hospital, another opportunity to reflect on his predicament. Despite his guarded nature, the events of the past few days had chipped away at the walls he had so carefully built around himself. The knock at the door was gentle but firm. Marcus looked up to see Dr. Evelyn Carter stepping into the room, her expression calm as always, clipboard in hand. Good morning, Mr. Hale, she said. How are you feeling today? Better, Marcus replied, his tone softer than before. The treatment is helping. Evelyn nodded. That's good to hear. We'll need to monitor your condition a little longer, but the inflammation is subsiding. She paused, her gaze steady. Is there anything you'd like to discuss before we proceed with your treatment plan? Marcus hesitated. His usual instinct was to dismiss such questions, to brush aside any attempt at deeper conversation. But today something was different. He cleared his throat, feeling the weight of the unspoken words between them. I want to apologize, he began, his voice strained, for the way I acted before. I was wrong. Evelyn's expression softened, though she remained composed. Thank you for saying that, she said. It takes courage to admit when we've made a mistake. Marcus looked away, uncomfortable with the vulnerability. I didn't realize who you were, that you're the medical director. Evelyn smiled faintly. I appreciate the sentiment, Mr. Hale, but my title shouldn't have mattered. What matters is how we treat each other, regardless of rank or status. Her words hung in the air, heavier than Marcus expected. He nodded, unsure how to respond, and Evelyn moved on to discuss his next steps. After Evelyn left, Marcus leaned back against the pillows, the conversation replaying in his mind. There was no hint of smugness or condescension in her tone, only grace and understanding. It unnerved him, how easily she had let go of his behavior. He wasn't used to kindness without strings attached, without some expectation of repayment. For most of his life, relationships had been transactional. Evelyn's unwavering professionalism and unexpected compassion were unfamiliar and disarming. That afternoon, Marcus's routine was interrupted by a visitor. Samuel Peterson, the elderly patient from the adjacent room, shuffled in with a newspaper tucked under his arm. Thought you might like some company, Samuel said, settling into the chair beside Marcus's bed. Marcus raised an eyebrow. You don't strike me as the shy type, Samuel. Samuel chuckled. Life's too short to keep to yourself, my friend. Besides, I figured you could use a distraction. As they talked, Marcus found himself listening more than speaking, a rare occurrence for the man who was usually quick to dominate a conversation. Samuel's stories were simple yet compelling, a window into a life rich with experience and hard-earned wisdom. You know, Samuel said, his tone turning reflective, Dr. Carter isn't just a great doctor. She's a great person. I've seen her go out of her way to help people who can't afford treatment, fighting with insurance companies and bending hospital rules to do what's right. Marcus frowned. She does that? She doesn't advertise it, Samuel replied, but she does it. That kind of selflessness is rare these days. Samuel's words stayed with Marcus long after the older man left. That night, Marcus stared out the window of his hospital room, the city lights glittering like distant stars. The anger and bitterness that had once fueled him now felt hollow. For years, he had built his life around power and control, convincing himself that his worth was tied to his accomplishments. But the events of the past few days had shown him a different truth. He thought of Madison's pointed words, Evelyn's quiet strength, and Samuel's stories of her selflessness. Each moment had chipped away at the armor he had worn for so long, exposing the vulnerable man beneath. The next morning, Marcus woke to the sound of bustling nurses and the faint hum of hospital machinery. As he sipped the weak coffee provided with his breakfast, Evelyn entered with her usual composure. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady as ever. "Morning," Marcus replied, setting the cup aside. Evelyn reviewed his chart and began to explain the next phase of his treatment. Her tone was clinical yet approachable, a perfect balance of professionalism and empathy. "I have one question," Marcus said, interrupting her. "Of course." Evelyn set the clipboard down and met his gaze. "Why didn't you report me? When I—" He trailed off, unable to say the words aloud. Evelyn's expression remained calm, though her eyes softened. "Because I didn't see the point," she said simply. "People make mistakes. What matters is whether they learn from them." Marcus felt his throat tighten. It wasn't the answer he had expected, but it was one he couldn't ignore. As the day progressed, Marcus found himself reflecting on Evelyn's words. He decided to take a small step forward, something that felt both uncomfortable and necessary. "Excuse me," he said to a passing nurse. "Could you do me a favor?" The nurse nodded. "Could you bring me a thank you card and a pen?" Later that evening, Marcus sat with the card in his hands, the pen hovering over the blank page. For a man who prided himself on his words, this simple gesture felt monumental. Finally, he wrote, "Dr. Carter, thank you for your care and patience. I'm sorry for my behavior before. You've shown me what it means to lead with kindness. I hope I can do the same someday. Sincerely, Marcus Hale." He folded the card and handed it to the nurse, instructing her to deliver it to Evelyn's office. The next morning, Evelyn entered Marcus's room, holding the card in her hand. "Thank you for this," she said, her tone warm but reserved. Marcus nodded, feeling a flicker of relief. "I meant it." Evelyn smiled faintly. "I believe you." For the first time, Marcus felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Before being discharged later that week, Marcus made a decision. He would not let this experience be another passing moment in his life. It was a chance to begin again, to reshape the man he had become. As he packed his belongings, he noticed Madison waiting by the door. "Ready to go?" she asked. Marcus nodded, then paused. "Madison, thank you. For being here. For saying what I needed to hear, even when I didn't want to listen." Madison's eyes widened in surprise, but her lips curled into a soft smile. "You're welcome, Dad." As they left the hospital, the city stretched out before them, full of possibilities. Marcus Hale had taken the first step toward a better version of himself, and though the road ahead was uncertain, he felt ready to face it. Marcus Hale sat in the passenger seat of Madison's car as they drove through the busy city streets. The rhythmic hum of the engine and the occasional honk of distant horns filled the silence between them. He glanced at his daughter, whose hands were steady on the wheel, and felt a pang of guilt. Their relationship had been distant for years, and now, for the first time in a long time, he was beginning to see how much he had taken her presence for granted. "You've been quiet," Madison said, her tone careful but probing. "I've had a lot to think about," Marcus replied, keeping his eyes on the passing buildings. Madison nodded, sensing his mood. "About what?" Marcus hesitated. "About how I've been living. About the things I've gotten wrong." Madison's grip on the steering wheel relaxed slightly. "It's good that you're thinking about it, Dad. But it's not just about thinking. It's about doing." Her words were simple, but they struck a chord. Marcus turned to look out the window, the weight of her statement settling over him. That evening, Marcus found himself in his penthouse, surrounded by the sleek furniture and modern decor that had once been a source of pride. Now it all felt cold and hollow. He sat at the dining table, staring at his untouched dinner, his thoughts drifting back to the hospital. Dr. Evelyn Carter's face came to mind, not her stern professionalism or her unyielding calm, but the kindness she had shown him despite everything. The note he had written felt like a small step in the right direction, but he knew it wasn't enough. The next morning, Marcus took another step. He called the hospital and left a message for Dr. Carter, asking to meet her in person. He wasn't entirely sure why he felt the need to see her again, but he knew he couldn't move forward without confronting his actions more directly. Dr. Carter agreed to meet him, and 2 days later, Marcus found himself back in the hospital. This time, he walked through the lobby with a sense of humility rather than entitlement. He was directed to Evelyn's office, a modest space filled with books, framed diplomas, and photos of smiling patients. Evelyn greeted him with her usual calm demeanor. "Mr. Hale," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "What brings you here?" Marcus took a seat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I wanted to thank you. Again, in person this time." Evelyn nodded, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate that, but I sense there's more on your mind." "There is," Marcus admitted. He took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. "I've spent most of my life looking down on people, judging them. I thought it made me stronger, but now I see it's made me small. And I think what bothers me most is how easily you forgave me. I don't deserve it." Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "Forgiveness isn't about deserving. It's about moving forward. If we waited for everyone to deserve forgiveness, the world would never heal." Her words left Marcus silent. For the first time, he felt the weight of his pride lifting, replaced by a quiet resolve. As Marcus left the hospital, he noticed a small flyer on the bulletin board near the elevators. It advertised a volunteer program at a community health clinic in a struggling part of the city. The clinic needed people to help with administrative work, fundraising, and patient support. Something about the flyer caught his attention. He took a photo of it with his phone, unsure why he felt drawn to the idea, but knowing he couldn't ignore it. The next day, Marcus called the number on the flyer. The woman who answered, Rebecca, was warm and enthusiastic. She invited him to visit the clinic and see how he could help. When Marcus arrived at the clinic, he was struck by how different it was from the hospital he had been treated at. The walls were faded, the furniture mismatched, and the air carried the faint scent of antiseptic. But what the clinic lacked in resources, it made up for in energy. The staff buzzed with activity, their determination evident in every movement. Rebecca, a middle-aged woman with a kind smile, greeted him at the front desk. "You must be Mr. Hale," she said, extending her hand. "Thanks for coming." Marcus shook her hand, feeling slightly out of place. "Just Marcus," he said, "and I'm not sure what I can offer, but I'd like to help." Rebecca's smile widened. "That's a good start. Let me show you around." As she gave him a tour, Marcus noticed patients of all ages waiting in the cramped lobby. Many wore expressions of exhaustion and worry, but they also seemed grateful to be there. It was a stark contrast to the affluent circles Marcus was used to. "We're always looking for volunteers to help with paperwork, organize donations, or even just talk to patients while they wait," Rebecca said. "A kind word goes a long way." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. This was unfamiliar territory, but it felt right. Over the next few weeks, Marcus began volunteering at the clinic. At first, he stuck to administrative tasks, organizing files, and making calls to potential donors. But gradually, he found himself drawn to the patients. He started small, greeting them as they arrived and offering coffee or water while they waited. One afternoon, he struck up a conversation with an elderly woman named Mrs. Green, who was waiting to see the doctor. Her stories about raising 7 children in the city's toughest neighborhoods were both heartwarming and heartbreaking. "You've got a good heart, young man," she said, patting his hand. "Don't let the world harden it." Her words stayed with Marcus, a reminder of the lessons he was learning every day at the clinic. Volunteering wasn't easy for Marcus. He struggled with his own impatience and the discomfort of being in an unfamiliar environment. But every challenge he faced brought him closer to understanding the value of humility and compassion. One evening, as he left the clinic, Marcus received a text from Madison. "Proud of you, Dad." The simple message brought a lump to his throat. For the first time in years, he felt like he was becoming the man she could look up to. One day, while organizing supplies in the clinic storeroom, Marcus heard a familiar voice behind him. "Mr. Hale?" He turned to see Dr. Evelyn Carter standing in the doorway. "Evelyn," he said, surprised, "what are you doing here?" "I volunteer here occasionally," she replied. "The clinic is close to my heart, and it looks like it's becoming important to you too." Marcus nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It is more than I expected." Evelyn stepped closer, her expression thoughtful. "Change isn't easy, but it's worth it, and it's never too late to start." Their conversation was brief, but it left Marcus feeling more determined than ever to continue his journey of growth. As Marcus drove home that night, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and white. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to chase them, to prove himself through material success. Instead, he felt a quiet sense of purpose, a conviction that his life could be about more than himself. Marcus Hale sat in the clinic's lobby, a stack of donation forms on the desk in front of him. The buzz of activity surrounded him, patients chatting in low tones, children laughing as they played with toys from a battered box, and staff members moving briskly between rooms. Despite the noise, Marcus found himself unusually calm. The clinic had become a sanctuary of sorts. The work, though tedious at times, grounded him. More importantly, it reminded him of the humanity he had so often overlooked in his climb to success. "Hey, Marcus," Rebecca called from across the room, interrupting his thoughts. "Mrs. Green's back today. She was asking if you'd be here." Marcus's lips curved into a small smile. Mrs. Green, the elderly woman he had befriended weeks ago, had a knack for brightening his day. He stood and walked to her usual seat, where she greeted him with a warm grin. "Well, look who it is," Mrs. Green said, her voice as rich and smooth as molasses. "The man with the fancy shoes, sitting here like one of us common folk." Marcus chuckled, glancing down at his polished loafers. "You always know how to keep me humble, Mrs. Green. Somebody's got to," she quipped. "So, what's new in your world?" As they talked, Marcus noticed something he hadn't before: a slight tremor in her hands and a faint pallor to her usually vibrant complexion. "Mrs. Green, are you feeling all right?" he asked, concern creeping into his voice. She waved him off. "Oh, I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired. The doctors here always take good care of me." Marcus wasn't entirely convinced, but he decided not to press the issue. Instead, he resolved to check in with Rebecca later to ensure Mrs. Green was getting the attention she needed. After Mrs. Green was called back for her appointment, Marcus returned to his desk. A few minutes later, a young boy with tousled hair and oversized glasses approached him, clutching a worn comic book. "Hi," the boy said shyly. "Hi there," Marcus replied, crouching slightly to meet the boy's gaze. "What's your name?" "Caleb," the boy said. He hesitated before adding, "I'm waiting for my mom. She's seeing the doctor." Marcus glanced at the book in Caleb's hands. "That's a good one. I used to read those when I was your age." "You did?" Caleb's eyes lit up with curiosity. "Sure did," Marcus said. "Superheroes are my favorite. They remind us that even when things get tough, we can find strength inside ourselves." Caleb nodded solemnly, clutching the book a little tighter. "I like that too." For the next 20 minutes, Marcus and Caleb talked about their favorite superheroes. It was a small moment, but as Caleb's mother returned and thanked Marcus for keeping her son entertained, he felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. Later that day, Dr. Evelyn Carter walked into the clinic for one of her regular volunteer shifts. Marcus spotted her immediately, her presence commanding attention without effort. "Evelyn," he said, approaching her with a nod. "Good to see you." "And you, Marcus," she replied. Her gaze swept over the busy clinic. "How are things going here?" "Good," Marcus said. He hesitated before adding, "I've been learning a lot." Evelyn smiled faintly. "I'm glad to hear that. Growth isn't always easy, but it's always worth it. "I've been meaning to thank you again," Marcus said, his tone earnest. "Not just for treating me, but for showing me that change is possible." Evelyn's eyes softened. "You've done the hard work, Marcus. I just held up a mirror." Her words struck a chord, reminding Marcus that his journey was far from over. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the clinic to find Rebecca looking unusually somber. "Mrs. Green's not doing well," she said quietly. "Her condition's worsened, and she's being transferred to the hospital." Marcus felt a pang of worry. "Is there anything I can do?" Rebecca hesitated, then nodded. "She asked for you. Maybe you could visit her later." That afternoon, Marcus drove to the hospital and found Mrs. Green's room. She looked frail but still managed a weak smile when he entered. "Marcus," she said softly, "you didn't have to come all this way." "I wanted to," he replied, pulling a chair closer to her bedside. "How are you feeling?" "Not great," she admitted. "But I've lived a good life, you know? No regrets." Marcus stayed with her for hours, listening as she recounted stories from her youth. Her resilience and grace in the face of adversity left him humbled. As Marcus drove home that evening, he couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Green. Her unwavering spirit reminded him of the quiet strength he had seen in Evelyn and the unshakable determination of the clinic staff. For so long, Marcus had viewed kindness as a weakness, a luxury he couldn't afford in his cutthroat world. But now, he was beginning to see it for what it truly was, a strength, a force that could transform lives, including his own. The next week, Marcus returned to the clinic with a renewed sense of purpose. He spent the morning organizing donations and making calls to local businesses, asking for their support. During a break, he noticed Caleb sitting in the lobby again, his comic book in hand. "Hey, Caleb," Marcus said, kneeling beside him. "How's it going?" "Okay," Caleb replied, his tone subdued. Marcus frowned. "What's wrong?" "My mom's been really sick," Caleb said quietly. "I'm scared." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "It's okay to be scared," he said gently. "But you're not alone. Your mom's in good hands here, and I'll be here too." "Okay." Caleb nodded, his eyes glistening with tears. That evening, as Marcus reflected on the day, he realized how much he had changed. The man who had once dismissed others as unworthy of his time now found himself deeply invested in their lives. He thought of Mrs. Green, of Caleb, and of the countless patients who walked through the clinic's doors every day. Their resilience inspired him, challenging him to be better, to do better. The following week, Marcus met with Rebecca to discuss a new initiative for the clinic. He proposed hosting a fundraising event to help cover the cost of medical supplies and services for patients in need. Rebecca's eyes lit up. "That's a fantastic idea, Marcus. I'll help in any way I can." As they began planning, Marcus felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. The clinic had become more than a place to volunteer. It had become a symbol of the man he wanted to be. That night, Marcus called Madison. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said. "For what?" she asked, surprised. "For believing in me," Marcus replied, "and for pushing me to see the world differently." Madison's voice softened. "I'm proud of you, Dad." As they talked, Marcus felt a warmth he hadn't known in years, a sense of connection, of belonging, and most importantly, of hope. The sun was just beginning to rise as Marcus Hale stepped into the clinic. The air was crisp with the promise of a new day, and the faint hum of early morning activity filled the space. Rebecca greeted him with her usual warmth, handing him a list of tasks for the day. "Big day ahead," she said with a grin. It was the first day of preparations for the fundraising gala. Marcus had proposed a chance to bring much-needed resources to the clinic. He had spent weeks organizing the event, leveraging his business connections and newfound passion for the clinic's mission. As he reviewed the guest list, Marcus felt a quiet sense of pride. This event wasn't just about raising money. It reflected the man he was becoming, a man who cared more about the impact he made than the image he projected. Midway through the morning, Rebecca pulled Marcus aside. Her usual cheerful demeanor was replaced by a somber expression. "Marcus, I just got a call from the hospital," she said. "Mrs. Green's condition has worsened. She's asking to see you." The news hit Marcus like a blow to the chest. Without hesitation, He grabbed his coat and headed for the hospital. When Marcus arrived at Mrs. Green's room, he found her surrounded by family. Her once lively eyes were now tired, but still warm as they met his. "Marcus," she said softly, her voice weaker than he'd ever heard it. He approached her bedside, taking her frail hand in his. "I'm here," he said. Mrs. Green smiled faintly. "I don't have much time left," she said, "but I wanted to thank you. You've been a good friend, and I'm proud of the man you're becoming." Marcus swallowed the lump in his throat, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "You've taught me more than I can ever repay," he said. Mrs. Green's family stepped forward, thanking Marcus for the kindness he had shown her in her final days. As they shared stories of her life, Marcus felt a deep sense of gratitude for the time he had spent with her. Later that evening, Marcus sat in his apartment, the quietness of the space weighing heavily on him. Mrs. Green's passing was a stark reminder of how fleeting life could be. For years, he had prioritized wealth and status, neglecting the relationships and moments that truly mattered. The thought of continuing down that path now seemed unbearable. He glanced at a framed photo of himself and Madison on the bookshelf, taken during one of their rare vacations years ago. He picked up his phone and dialed her number. "Hey, Dad," Madison answered, her voice bright. "I just wanted to hear your voice," Marcus said, his tone uncharacteristically tender. "Everything okay?" she asked, concern creeping in. "It will be," he said. I'm trying to make up for lost time." Madison was quiet for a moment before replying. "I'm here, Dad, and I'm proud of the changes you're making." The next day, Marcus returned to the clinic with renewed determination. He spent the morning coordinating gala details, ensuring every aspect of the event was perfect. As he was reviewing the seating chart, a familiar voice interrupted him. "Marcus," said Dr. Evelyn Carter, stepping into the room. He turned, surprised but pleased to see her. "Evelyn," he said, "what brings you here?" "I heard about Mrs. Green," she said gently. "I'm sorry for your loss." Marcus nodded, his expression somber. "She was an incredible woman. She made me want to be better." Evelyn smiled faintly. "She had that effect on people. And it seems like you're honoring her memory in the best way possible." They spent a few moments in silence before Evelyn spoke again. "You know, Marcus, you've come a long way. But growth doesn't end when the pain fades. It's a continuous process." Her words stayed with Marcus as he returned to his work. The night of the gala arrived, and the clinic's transformation was stunning. Twinkling lights hung from the ceiling, and elegant tables lined the room. Marcus stood near the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived. As the room filled with laughter and conversation, he felt a sense of accomplishment. But more than that, he felt a sense of belonging. Halfway through the evening, Marcus took the stage to address the attendees. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady. "Thank you all for being here tonight. This clinic has become more than just a place to volunteer for me. It's a symbol of hope, resilience, and community. Your support tonight will help ensure that everyone who walks through these doors feels seen, valued, and cared for." The room erupted in applause, and as Marcus stepped down from the stage, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. After the gala, Marcus found Evelyn standing near the exit. "Thank you for coming," he said, his tone sincere. "You did a great job tonight," she replied. "I think Mrs. Green would be proud." Marcus smiled, a mix of pride and humility in his expression. "I couldn't have done it without people like you showing me what's possible." Evelyn placed a hand on his shoulder. "The work you've done here is just the beginning, Marcus. Don't stop now." As the night ended, Marcus returned home, his thoughts racing. He no longer saw success as a solitary pursuit. It was about the connections he made, the lives he touched, and the legacy he left behind. For the first time in years, he felt at peace not because he had achieved perfection, but because he had embraced the imperfections that made him human. Marcus Hale sat in his office at the clinic the morning after the gala, a cup of coffee cooling beside him. He glanced at the event ledger on his desk, which detailed the total funds raised. The numbers were impressive, more than double the original goal. But the money wasn't what lingered in Marcus's mind. It was the faces of the people who had come together, many of whom he would never have encountered in his old life. The clinic had taught him something he hadn't learned in years of boardroom meetings and high-stakes deals. that real success was measured by the impact you had on others. Rebecca walked into the office, holding a clipboard and wearing her usual bright smile. "Marcus, I got something for you," she said, setting the clipboard on his desk. "What's this?" he asked, scanning the papers. "It's an official offer," Rebecca said. "We've been talking about how much you've done for the clinic and how invested you are in its success. We want you to join the advisory board." Marcus blinked, caught off guard. "Advisory board?" Rebecca nodded. "You'd help oversee operations, organize events like the gala, and work with local leaders to expand our reach. You've already been doing the work unofficially, so we thought it was time to make it formal." Marcus leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words sinking in. The man he had been 6 months ago would have balked at the idea of taking on such a role. But now he felt something else entirely. Purpose. "I'd be honored," he said finally. The advisory board role quickly became a new focus for Marcus. His days were filled with meetings, brainstorming sessions, and outreach efforts. He found himself drawing on his business acumen in unexpected ways, leveraging his contacts to secure new partnerships and donations for the clinic. One afternoon, he met with a local business owner who had expressed interest in supporting the clinic. The man, a younger version of Marcus in many ways, sat across the table with an air of skepticism. "So, what's in it for me?" the man asked, his tone curt. Marcus smiled knowingly. "I used to think that way," he said. "But what I've learned is that the return on investment isn't always financial. Supporting this clinic isn't just about charity, it's about building trust in your community. That trust will serve you in ways you can't measure." The man seemed to consider this for a moment. "You really believe that?" "I do," Marcus said, his voice steady. "And if you give it a chance, I think you will too." By the end of the meeting, the man had agreed to a sizable donation, and Marcus felt a flicker of pride, not in the deal itself, but in the way he had used his skills to create something meaningful. As Marcus's life at the clinic flourished, he found himself increasingly focused on repairing his relationship with Madison. Though their conversations had grown warmer, there was still a distance between them, a gap he knew he had created over years of neglect. One evening, he invited her to dinner at a small, family-owned restaurant she had always loved. Madison arrived wearing a soft smile, her hair loosely pulled back. She looked less guarded than usual, but Marcus could still sense her hesitance. "Thanks for coming," he said as they sat down. "I know I haven't been the best at showing up." Madison shrugged. "You're trying now. That matters." "I want to do more than try," Marcus said, his voice earnest. "I want to be the father you deserve. I know I can't undo the past, but I hope we can build something better." Madison studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "I'd like that too, Dad." For the first time in years, Marcus felt a sense of hope for their relationship. One afternoon at the clinic, Marcus was sorting through donation forms when a familiar figure walked in. Caleb, the boy with the comic books. This time, he wasn't holding a book. Instead, he clutched a handmade card. "Hi, Mr. Marcus," Caleb said shyly. "Hey, Caleb," Marcus replied, crouching to his level. "What's that you've got there?" "It's for you," Caleb said, holding out the card. Marcus took it and opened it carefully. Inside, in bright crayon, were the words, "Thank you for being my hero." Below was a drawing of Marcus in a cape, standing beside Caleb and his mother. Marcus felt his throat tighten. "This is amazing, Caleb." "Thank you." Caleb beamed. "You said superheroes find strength inside themselves, right? That's what you did." Marcus pulled Caleb into a gentle hug. "You're the real hero, buddy." As Caleb ran off to join his mother, Marcus sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the unexpected gesture. It was a small moment, but it carried more meaning than he could put into words. Inspired by Caleb's card, Marcus decided to expand the clinic's outreach efforts. He began working with Rebecca and the board to organize free health screenings in underserved neighborhoods. The events brought in dozens of new patients, many of whom had never had access to consistent medical care. During one of these events, Marcus spotted a man sitting alone near the entrance. The man looked disheveled, his clothes worn and his shoulders hunched. "Hi there," Marcus said, approaching him. "I'm Marcus. Can I help you with anything?" The man looked up, his eyes wary. "I don't know if anyone can." Marcus sat beside him. "Sometimes, just talking helps." The man hesitated, then began to share his story, a series of hardships that had left him feeling invisible and hopeless. Marcus listened intently, offering quiet words of encouragement. By the end of their conversation, the man agreed to see one of the clinic's doctors. As Marcus watched him walk toward the exam room, he felt a sense of fulfillment that no business deal had ever given him. One evening, as Marcus was wrapping up for the day, Dr. Evelyn Carter stopped by his office. "I heard about the health screenings," she said, her tone warm. "You're doing incredible work, Marcus." "Thank you," he said. "I've learned from the best." Evelyn smiled, but her expression turned thoughtful. "You've come a long way, but I hope you know this isn't the end of the journey. Growth is ongoing." Marcus nodded. "I'm starting to understand that. But for the first time, I feel like I'm on the right path." Evelyn placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are." As Marcus drove home that night, he reflected on how much his life had changed. The clinic had become more than a place to give back. It had become a source of connection, purpose, and healing. The ripple effect of kindness was undeniable. It had started with Evelyn's grace and grown into something far greater, touching not just Marcus's life, but the lives of everyone he encountered. For the first time in years, Marcus felt a sense of peace, not because his journey was complete, but because he knew he was moving forward, one step at a time. The clinic bustled with its usual energy as Marcus Hale stepped through the doors, greeted by the familiar hum of activity. Patients filled the lobby, staff moved swiftly from room to room, and the faint scent of antiseptic lingered in the air. Marcus had grown accustomed to this environment. It felt more like home than the stark luxury of his penthouse ever had. Rebecca waved him over from the front desk. "Marcus, good timing. We got another health screening event this weekend. I could use your help with logistics." "Count me in," Marcus replied. The satisfaction of being useful had become a vital part of his daily life. Each small contribution felt like another step toward the man he wanted to become. Before he could say more, the door opened, and a group of new patients walked in. Among them was a face that stopped Marcus in his tracks. Alan Wexler, his former business partner. Alan was as polished as ever, his tailored suit and expensive watch a stark contrast to the clinic's modest surroundings. But his confident stride faltered when he saw Marcus. "Marcus," Alan said, his voice tinged with disbelief. The two men shook hands, though the gesture felt awkward. Alan's eyes darted around the clinic, taking in the worn furniture and faded walls. "I didn't expect to see you here," Alan said, his tone edged with curiosity. "Things have changed," Marcus replied evenly. "What brings you to the clinic?" "My wife," Alan said, gesturing to a woman seated nearby. "She's been having some health issues. Someone recommended this place." Marcus nodded. "The care here is excellent. You're in good hands." Alan looked skeptical, his polished veneer cracking slightly. "It's not what I'm used to." "It wasn't for me either," Marcus admitted. "But I've learned a lot since I started volunteering here." Alan raised an eyebrow. "Volunteering? That's not the Marcus Hale I remember." "Maybe you didn't know me as well as you thought," Marcus said, his tone calm but firm. As Alan walked away to join his wife, Marcus felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Alan represented a life he had left behind, a life defined by power, control, and self-interest. Seeing him again was like looking at a reflection of his former self, a reminder of the man he had been. Later, during a quiet moment in his office, Marcus found himself replaying old memories. He thought about the countless deals he and Alan had closed, the relentless drive for success that had consumed them both. It had seemed so important then, but now it felt hollow. Rebecca's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You okay?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Yeah," Marcus said, though his tone betrayed him. "Just an unexpected visitor." Rebecca smiled knowingly. "Funny how life has a way of circling back, isn't it?" On Saturday morning, the clinic's health screening event was in full swing. Tents and tables filled the parking lot, offering free consultations, blood tests, and wellness advice. The turnout was larger than expected, a testament to the clinic's growing reputation. Marcus worked tirelessly, coordinating volunteers and ensuring patients were seen promptly. Despite the chaos, he found himself energized by the sense of purpose that came with helping others. In the afternoon, he spotted Alan again, this time sitting alone under a tent. His wife had already been seen by a doctor and was chatting with other patients. Alan, however, looked out of place, his usual confidence replaced by a distant expression. Marcus approached him cautiously. "Alan, how's your wife doing?" "Better, I think," Alan replied. He hesitated, then added, "This place, it's different. But it's good." "It is," Marcus agreed. He took a seat beside Alan, letting the silence linger for a moment. "What's on your mind?" Alan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Seeing you here, it's not what I expected. Last time we talked, you were still running that real estate empire, calling all the shots." "I thought that was what mattered," Marcus said. "But I was wrong." Alan frowned. "What changed?" Marcus paused, choosing his words carefully. "I hit a wall. My life looked perfect on the outside, but inside, it was empty. Coming here, working with these people has taught me that success isn't about what you have. It's about what you give." Alan studied him, skepticism giving way to something softer. "Maybe I need to rethink a few things myself," he said quietly. Over the next few weeks, Alan became a frequent visitor to the clinic, often accompanying his wife to follow-up appointments. Each time, he lingered a little longer, watching Marcus work and occasionally striking up conversations with patients and staff. One afternoon, Alan approached Marcus with a proposition. "I want to help," he said. "I've got resources, connections. Tell me what the clinic needs, and I'll make it happen." Marcus was taken aback, but quickly recovered. "That's generous of you, Alan. We could always use more support." Alan smiled faintly. "Maybe I need this as much as the clinic does." A few days later, Marcus shared the news with Dr. Evelyn Carter during one of her visits to the clinic. "Alan Wexler?" Evelyn said, her eyebrows rising. "The same one you used to work with?" "The very same," Marcus replied, his tone wry. "It's strange, but I think he's starting to see things differently. Maybe being here is rubbing off on him." Evelyn smiled. "Kindness has a way of doing that. It's contagious." Her words stayed with Marcus as he reflected on the ripple effect his own journey had created. By embracing change, he had not only transformed his own life, but also inspired others to do the same. In the weeks that followed, Alan became more involved with the clinic, using his skills and resources to support new initiatives. He and Marcus worked together to launch a mentorship program for young professionals, pairing them with experienced volunteers to foster a culture of giving back. The program's success brought a sense of fulfillment neither man had expected. For Marcus, it was a reminder that even the most unlikely connections could lead to something meaningful. One evening, as they wrapped up a meeting, Alan turned to Marcus. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice sincere, "for the way I treated you back when we worked together. I wasn't exactly a shining example of integrity." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We both made mistakes, but what matters is what we do now." Alan extended his hand, and Marcus shook it firmly. It wasn't just a gesture of forgiveness, it was the start of a new chapter in their relationship. As Marcus drove home that night, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The clinic had not only given him a second chance, but had also shown him the power of connection, forgiveness, and shared purpose. He thought of Evelyn's words, "Kindness is contagious." She was right. And as he looked toward the future, Marcus knew he would continue to spread that kindness, one ripple at a time. The morning sun poured through the windows of the clinic, casting a warm glow over the bustling lobby. Marcus Hale stood by the front desk, reviewing the progress of the mentorship program he and Alan Wexler had initiated. It had only been a few weeks since its launch, but the response had been overwhelming. Young professionals from diverse backgrounds had eagerly signed up to work alongside experienced volunteers, bringing fresh energy and new ideas to the clinic. "Marcus," Rebecca called, breaking his focus. "There's someone here to see you." Marcus turned to see Alan standing near the entrance, a slight smile on his face. Beside him was a young man in his early 20s, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt that didn't quite fit his lanky frame. "Thought I'd bring someone by to meet you," Alan said as they approached. "This is James. He's been shadowing me in my office, but I think he'd benefit from spending some time here." James extended his hand, his grip firm but nervous. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Hale." "Nice to meet you too, James," Marcus replied warmly. "What brings you here?" "I've been looking for ways to give back," James said, his voice tentative. "Mr. Wexler said this clinic is doing great work." Alan clapped a hand on James's shoulder. "I told him you'd be a good mentor." Marcus chuckled. "Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. But if you're willing to learn, we're happy to have you." Over the next few days, James shadowed Marcus, observing everything from patient interactions to logistical planning. Marcus was struck by the young man's curiosity and eagerness to contribute. He reminded Marcus of himself at that age, ambitious, but unsure of his direction. During a quiet moment, Marcus sat down with James in the break room. "What's your story?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. James hesitated, his hands fidgeting. "I grew up in a rough neighborhood," he admitted. "Not a lot of opportunities. I've always wanted to do something meaningful, but it's hard to know where to start." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I used to think meaning came from success, from climbing the ladder and accumulating things. But I've learned it's about the impact you have on others. This clinic taught me that." James looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and determination. "I want to learn from you." Marcus smiled. "Then let's get to work." As the mentorship program gained momentum, so did the clinic's challenges. The growing number of patients and volunteers began to strain its limited resources. Rebecca approached Marcus one afternoon with a concerned look. "We're running low on supplies," she said. "And with the new programs, we're struggling to keep up with demand." Marcus rubbed his chin, considering the situation. "We'll figure it out," he said. "We always do." He reached out to Alan that evening, and the two began brainstorming ways to secure additional funding. Alan suggested hosting a community event, a day of free services, workshops, and activities designed to raise awareness and generate support. "It'll take a lot of work," Alan said, "but I think we can pull it off." Marcus agreed, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The clinic had become more than just a place to volunteer. It was a beacon of hope, and he was determined to keep its light shining. The community event was held on a crisp Saturday morning, transforming the clinic's parking lot into a vibrant hub of activity. Tents and tables lined the space, offering everything from health screenings to financial literacy workshops. Children laughed as they played games, while volunteers handed out snacks and water. Marcus moved through the crowd, checking in with staff and greeting attendees. He spotted James helping a group of young volunteers set up a booth for job readiness resources. The young man's enthusiasm was infectious, drawing people in with ease. "Looks like you're a natural," Marcus said as he approached. James grinned. "I'm just following your lead." Nearby, Alan was deep in conversation with a local business owner, pitching the importance of supporting the clinic. Seeing him so engaged filled Marcus with pride. The man who had once been his rival had become a trusted partner, proof of how far they had both come. As the event continued, Marcus noticed a familiar face weaving through the crowd, Dr. Evelyn Carter. She wasn't wearing her usual white coat, but instead dressed casually in jeans and a sweater. She smiled when she saw him. "Evelyn," Marcus said, surprised but pleased. "What brings you here?" "I couldn't miss this," she replied. "You've turned this clinic into something incredible, Marcus." "It's a team effort," he said modestly. "But thank you. That means a lot coming from you." Evelyn's gaze swept over the bustling scene. "You know, when I first met you, I never would have imagined you'd end up here." Marcus chuckled. "Neither did I." She placed a hand on his arm. "You've done more than change yourself. You've created something that changes others. That's a legacy to be proud of." As the sun began to set, Marcus stood on a makeshift stage to address the crowd. The buzz of conversation quieted as he stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This clinic is more than just a place for medical care. It's a place for connection, for growth, and for hope. None of this would be possible without the support of people like you." He paused, scanning the crowd. "I used to think success was about what you could achieve for yourself. But I've learned that real success comes from what you give to others. This clinic has changed my life, and I hope it's touched yours as well." The crowd erupted into applause, and Marcus stepped back, his heart full. He spotted Madison in the front row, clapping with tears in her eyes. Their relationship had come so far, and seeing her pride meant more to him than any accolade ever could. That night, as Marcus sat in his apartment, he felt a deep sense of contentment. The event had been a success, but more importantly, it had solidified the clinic's place in the community. He thought about Evelyn's words earlier that day. "You've created something that changes others." It was true. The clinic had become a symbol of what was possible when people came together with a shared purpose. But Marcus knew his journey wasn't over. There was still work to be done, more lives to touch, more lessons to learn. And for the first time in years, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The clinic hummed with its usual energy as Marcus Hale walked through the front doors, greeted by the familiar sight of patients waiting, volunteers working, and staff buzzing from task to task. But today felt different, calmer, quieter somehow. It was as if the whirlwind of activity had settled into a steady rhythm, one that reflected the growth and resilience the clinic had fostered over the months. "Good morning, Marcus," Rebecca called from the front desk, her smile as warm as ever. "You're just in time. Dr. Carter's here for her weekly visit, and she asked to see you." Marcus felt a small pang of curiosity. Evelyn's visits were usually brief and focused on patient care, but the request sounded personal. He made his way to her office, wondering what she had in mind. Evelyn was seated at her desk, reviewing a stack of files, when Marcus knocked on the doorframe. She looked up, her expression softening into a smile. "Come in, Marcus," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. He sat down, feeling a faint sense of anticipation. "Rebecca said you wanted to see me." Evelyn nodded. "I did. I just wanted to take a moment to thank you." Marcus frowned slightly, caught off guard. "For what?" "For everything you've done here," she said. "When you first walked into my office, I never would have guessed you'd become such an integral part of this place. But you've proven me wrong in the best possible way." Marcus smiled, the humility in her words settling over him like a warm blanket. "It wasn't just me," he said. "This clinic is a reflection of all of us, our work, our commitment, our belief in each other." Evelyn nodded. "True, but leadership matters, and you've shown what it means to lead with kindness and purpose. I wanted you to know that." Her words filled Marcus with a quiet sense of pride, not the flashy arrogance of his former life, but a deep, genuine pride in the person he was becoming. As Marcus left Evelyn's office, he spotted James in the hallway, helping a group of volunteers unload supplies. The young man's enthusiasm was infectious, drawing smiles from everyone around him. Marcus approached, clapping a hand on James's shoulder. "Looking good out there," Marcus said. James grinned. "Thanks, Mr. Hale. I've been trying to keep up with you." Marcus chuckled. "You're doing more than that, James. You're leading by example, and that's what matters." James hesitated, his expression turning serious. "I've been thinking about what you said, that success is about what you give, not what you get. It's changed the way I see things. I just wanted to say thanks." Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat. "You're welcome, James. And remember, this is just the beginning. Keep pushing yourself, and you'll do great things." Later that day, Marcus sat in a conference room with Rebecca, Alan, and a few members of the clinic's advisory board. They were reviewing plans for a new expansion project, a way to reach more patients and provide additional services. The discussion was lively, filled with ideas and solutions, but also moments of tension as they debated the best path forward. Alan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "This is ambitious, Marcus. Are we sure we can pull it off?" Marcus met his gaze steadily. "It is ambitious," he admitted, "but I think we can do it. This clinic has proven time and again that we're capable of more than we realize. We just have to believe in it." Rebecca nodded. "I'm with Marcus on this one. The need is there, and we have the momentum to make it happen." After a moment of silence, Alan sighed, a small smile creeping onto his face. "Fine, let's do it." The room erupted in a mix of laughter and applause, the sense of shared purpose lifting everyone's spirits. That evening, Marcus decided to take a detour on his way home. He found himself driving through the neighborhood where he had grown up, a modest area filled with old brick houses and tree-lined streets. It had been years since he'd been back, but something about the day's events made him want to reconnect with his roots. He parked outside his childhood home and sat for a moment, staring at the familiar facade. Memories flooded back, some good, some painful, but all of them shaped the man he had become. As he sat there, he realized how far he had come, not just in distance but in spirit. The boy who had dreamed of escaping this neighborhood, who thought success was measured in dollars and power, had found something far more valuable: a sense of purpose. The following weekend, the clinic held a celebration to honor its volunteers and staff. The event was smaller than the gala, but just as meaningful, a chance to reflect on their collective achievements. Marcus stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as people laughed, shared stories, and celebrated their hard work. He felt a hand on his arm and turned to see Madison standing beside him. "You've done something incredible here, Dad," she said, her eyes shining with pride. "I couldn't have done it without you," Marcus replied. "You were the one who pushed me to see the world differently." Madison smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I'm proud of you, not just for what you've done, but for who you've become." Marcus pulled her into a hug, his heart full. As the celebration wound down, Marcus found himself standing with Evelyn, Rebecca, and Alan, the four of them watching the crowd with a shared sense of accomplishment. "What's next?" Rebecca asked, her tone playful. Marcus smiled. "More of this, more connection, more growth, more hope." Evelyn nodded, her gaze steady. "And more kindness. It's what brought us here, and it's what will carry us forward." Marcus looked around, taking in the faces of the people who had become his community, his family. For the first time in his life, he felt complete, not because of what he had gained, but because of what he had given. As Marcus walked to his car that night, he glanced back at the clinic, its lights glowing softly in the darkness. It was more than a building, it was a symbol of everything he had learned, everything he had fought for. He thought of Evelyn's words, "Kindness is what will carry us forward." She was right, and as he drove away, he knew that legacy would continue to grow, not just through him, but through everyone whose lives the clinic touched. It was a legacy of grace, and it was just the beginning.